Welcome back. Now, financial crime watchdog, the Financial Action Task Force, is expected to decide on whether South Africa will be greylisted. Research done by the Business Leadership South Africa found there's an 85% chance that the country will be listed. The task force greylists countries that are seen as being unable to counter financial crimes like money laundering and financial terrorism. To talk to us about what we can expect as well as the implications of this, I'm joined by Sociology Professor at the University of Johannesburg, Patrick Bond. Thank you so much for your time, Prof. We do appreciate it. I wonder what is going to come out on the 24th of February, which is next week, Friday, when the decision is actually made about South Africa being grey-listed or not. How do things look?
Well, the consensus seems to be that we've tried, at least Treasury and the Reserve Bank, and Parliament has passed a couple of laws that President Ramaphosa signed to prevent this, but it's very difficult because South Africa has had such lax regulations and, let's say, very ineffectual regulators at the Treasury and the Reserve Bank. And so, as you say, many in the financial community expect quite harsh measures, which would then increase costs for many of the financiers who need to go back and forth, or they think they do, with major international financial transactions. And the dilemma this week is that even though the Finance Director General, Ismail Mamamyat, spent a few days in Morocco late last month, these are processes that are very hard to reverse if they've been, in a sense, degenerating for more than a decade.
Yeah, maybe just speak to us about the implications, because as much as, for example, the National Prosecuting Authority has made attempts to try and strengthen all of this from happening, what is it actually going to mean should we be greylisted on Friday?
Well, I think the probable medium-term consequences will be felt most explicitly in the stock market. And in some ways, that's not necessarily bad, because we do have a great deal of foreign money flowing in and out, hot money. And of course, the return on investments in South Africa have been very high, especially for interest-bearing loans. They're 10, 11, 12%. The stock market has been ranked as usually the first amongst the emerging markets, in fact, the first in the world, aside from Hong Kong, in what's called the Buffett indicator. That is the capitalization, the amount of money in the stock market in relation to the size of the economy. So we have a very liquid stock market, and I suspect it will be much less liquid after these regulations make it tougher. What it effectively means is that anyone wanting to move money into South Africa has that extra burden of showing that they're not dealing with a criminal enterprise. And I think that will slow the hot money flow. Portfolio investment, it's sometimes called. And in some ways, that's not a bad thing, because we do have an excessively bubbly stock market that attracts, I think, far too much of the country's capital. The big dilemma is that the number 4 stock market in the world for, let's say, money laundering, the 4th worst tax haven, is called Amsterdam, and that's where most of our pension funds ended up when the biggest, the biggest company, Process, which was connected to Naspers, basically started there. And so a lot of our funds flowed out. And that's one of the ironies. It was commented on in Business Day this week that some of these jurisdictions that have put the Financial Action Task Force to work against countries like South Africa themselves need to be cleaned up. And I would put Amsterdam at the very top. But of course, it's Bermuda, Cayman Islands, some of those in the British banking tradition as well.
What is this going to do to South Africa's reputation, Prof, if we are greylisted on Friday?
You know, it's a mixed reputation already, Heidi, isn't it? Because the World Economic Forum has always said that South Africa's financial markets are not only deep, partly because of that financial bubbling in the stock market and a well-developed credit market for corporates and for the wealthier part of the society, but the PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, biannual economic survey during the 2010s put the South African corporates as the #1 most corrupt and fraudulent group amongst all the countries that they survey. So we've already got a mixed reputation. I think that the period in which Gupta's and allies were able to get so much money, for example, to Dubai, another major tax haven, or even President Ramaphosa named in the Paradise Papers as having a Mauritian account for Shanduka, and he was also with lawmen responsible for moving money to Bermuda, as the Farlam Commission showed, and as the chair of MTN, also a company that particularly in Nigeria, but in many other African countries, was accused of money laundering. We do have a long-standing problem, and our leaders are part of it, and I think our Treasury and Reserve Bank are going to get, let's say, a reputational dilemma, right? That they're going to have to act much harder and faster, not just have laws in place, but really work with, hopefully, a revived national prosecutor to get some of these bankers into jail, because they really have been facilitating, according to Treasury, up to 7% of GDP in illicit financial flows from South Africa every year.
I'm just wondering, Prof, and I'm not sure if you would be able to answer this or if we'll get further clarity on Friday when a decision is made, but once a country is grey-listed, how long do they stay in that grey area, and what needs to be done? Do they just have certain lists, certain requirements rather, that they need to follow? Is there a time frame that we stay grey-listed for?
Well, yes, it's until the reviews come back and say that the problems in typically about 11 categories where South Africa's failed in the 2019 review. So it could be done within a year and a half or so. That's the fastest that a country that I know of has gotten off the grey list. That was Mauritius. So we are obviously seeing a lot of interest in what laws and what regulatory system was put into place, especially with Reserve Bank and exchange control, and assessing whether the number of large transactions, which are in the tens of thousands every year, are really being monitored properly by these regulators. Other countries have stayed on for years and years, and there are many, like the DRC or Syria or South Sudan, that are probably not going to come off in my lifetime. I mean, they're very stuck in a mode in which corporate cowboys are running the show and the financiers are letting it happen.
Just lastly, Prof, I want to ask you if you think anything that's going to be said by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana on Wednesday in his budget speech, if that is going to have any impact on the decision that will be made on Friday, or not really?
You know, I hope so, because Finance Minister Godongwana, who had originally come from the left side of the spectrum, had been a NUMSA General Secretary, a leading member of the Communist Party. He took a strong deregulatory or neoliberal turn, and as a result, last year, if you recall, he gave a speech that included a 4 trillion rand exchange control deregulation. So he took our restrictions on our pension funds and our institutional investments, insurance funds, and so forth, and instead of keeping 70% in the country, only 50%. That meant quite a strong outflow of funds that could go as high as 4 trillion rand. It's time to, I think, reverse that, partly for ethical reasons. The people who are wealthy typically have white skin, and that's the residue of apartheid. And the crime against humanity in which people did get wealthy, I think, should result in that funding staying in the country, not escaping forever. But secondly, it's really the most critical thing to control our own economy, to have economic sovereignty. As John Maynard Keynes, the greatest capitalist economist of the 20th century, said, it's really critical to have exchange controls. And I hope Enoch Godongwana takes this as an opportunity, even if it is compelled from outside the Financial Action Task Force and the threat of financial sanctions, to say it's time that we actually circulate funds inside instead of letting them flow outside.
I think it's going to be a big financial and economic week ahead. Thank you so much for your insights. That's a sociology professor at the University of Johannesburg, Patrick Bond.